Hello everyone, it's Peter Newman here, the ARI and WeedSmart Western Region agronomist, and welcome to another webinar with WeedSmart. Today it is a webinar, as you should well know, as a question and answer session for our pre-em herbicides course that was delivered by Chris Preston and Mark Congreve. So very fortunate to have Chris and Mark on today. We'll speak to them in just a moment. Just the regular housekeeping of WeedSmart. We always like to acknowledge where the WeedSmart money comes from. So all of those companies and bodies above the line there are our financial contributors to WeedSmart, with GRDC being the major stakeholder, but also great support from all of those chemical and seed companies. And the organisations below the line are our in-kind supporters, and we have two of those with us today. And so these are people and industries that give us good support by helping us with personnel and running events and so on. So yeah, thank you very much. WeedSmart's this great industry-led initiative where we're trying to have this one united voice about weed management coming from the whole of industry and led by us at ARI and WeedSmart. So Lisa Mayer runs the WeedSmart initiative based in ARI, does a great job, and she has organised today's webinar as part of this Diversity Era 101 pre-em herbicide course. Diversity Era is our online learning platform within WeedSmart. It's part of WeedSmart, and it's about once every year or two we put up a new course. This is our third one that we've developed, and it's about herbicide resistance, pre-emergent herbicides, I should say. And Chris Preston and Mark Congreve were good enough to help out and deliver this program. They flew to Perth to film the videos and shared their wealth of knowledge. And today they're with us to share their knowledge to answer some of your questions. So I'll just quickly say hello to you both. How are you, Chris?
I'm well, thanks.
Whereabouts are you today? Are you in Adelaide or are you in Sydney?
I'm in Adelaide today, yeah.
That's a rare day. It hasn't rained. No, it hasn't rained anywhere really. Not that I'm aware of. What about you, Mark? Where are you coming from? And I think there has been a bit of rain in your part of the world.
Oh, it depends where you are, Pete. Yeah, so yeah, I'm over on the eastern seaboard at home this week after spending a couple of weeks over in the west, over in your part of the world, the last 2 weeks.
Righto. Delivering courses on this exact topic. So excellent. All right, well, let's get stuck into it. So the idea today is for us to just have a bit of a look at all of the modules. I've got the slides on screen now and would like to have your questions. It's not really a speak at you. It's really about just trying to answer some questions that have come up through the program. So if anyone's got a question straight off the bat, type it in there now. We've got a couple that have come in earlier, which we'll get to in a few moments. But while people might be doing that, we'll just go quickly through some of the slides. I've got them all, and you should be seeing the glyphosate-resistant weeds in Australia slide at the moment. And Chris, I don't know if you'd like to just tee off a bit with that and talking a little bit about how resistance to other herbicides like glyphosate and our other post-ems has really given us a bigger reliance on pre-em herbicides in Australia.
Well, Pete, that's exactly right. I mean, you know, if we had post-emergent herbicides and they worked on every weed species we had, we may not be that interested in pre-emergent herbicides. But I think that the glyphosate resistant story is a really good story of how resistance has completely changed a farming system. And so while we've got resistance in both the southern winter cropping dominated farming systems, glyphosate resistance is probably more of an issue in those northern fallow systems. And this is where the challenge has really been, because in the south we've been able to replace glyphosate with some other things, but in the north we've found that really hard. You know, paraquat doesn't work quite as well as glyphosate. And certainly the thinking of those of us who have been in this space is that, you know, this is a place where we really need some residual control to help us get us through that fallow system. So, you know, glyphosate resistance, but resistance in weeds in general has really been driving our farming system in Australia down this residual pre-emergent herbicide track.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And if you look at that chart on the table there, we had our first glyphosate resistance confirmed in Australia in '96, and then a few populations turning up. And then since 2013, we've had a lot of different weed species with resistance confirmed to glyphosate. So, yeah, that is sort of increasing at an increasing rate, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I think it's what we would expect that to happen with herbicide resistance. Is widely used herbicides, we tend to get more and more resistance, because even if we get resistance, people don't necessarily stop using them. They'll just supplement them with other tactics. But I think that one of the things about our management of glyphosate resistance is, it was a long time between ryegrass and barnyard grass. And we were really quite successful in the early years in the south at managing this as a problem. Now, of course, it's a massive issue, but in fact, our biggest issues in the south are actually resistant to the other post-emergent herbicides, particularly clethodim.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and Mark, Chris alluded to the fact that in the north, glyphosate resistance came along, and you found it quite hard to replace with other herbicides. Have you got any comments there, and any thoughts on that sort of journey that you guys have had recently, where a lot of this glyphosate resistance has really largely turned up in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I guess, Pete, it just really reinforces that we get resistance first, or quite often first, to the main weed control tactics that we're using in the program. So, the way I look at it is, in the south, we had a heavy reliance on the in-crop post-emergent herbicides, and they're the ones that broke. In the north, a lot of our weed control was around multiple applications over that summer period. In theory, where it rains in summer, in the ideal world, we're getting multiple germinations. That means multiple applications, so putting a lot of pressure on glyphosate. So it's not surprising that that's been where we've seen the biggest break in the system. I guess I'd add to that as well, in the areas where we've got the ability to double crop and we can grow summer or winter crops, that does give us another tool that, a lot of growers have used quite successfully to be able to rotate cropping programs between a few years of summer crop, then a few years of winter crop, which can drive weed numbers down, and we can get on top of the weeds in different parts of the program. But still, yeah, glyphosate's underpinning so much of either the summer or the winter crop programs. It's not surprising we're having a number of issues.
Yeah, righto. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, okay. Well, what we're going to do now is we'll go through a few of the modules quickly, and as I said, please put up any questions. But that was sort of the introduction module there, and then Chris in the program did a few modules just on the background of pre-ems in general, which goes across the south and the north. And Chris, part of this sort of first main module here was a little bit about the position of your weed seeds and how to get the best out of your pre-em herbicides, knowing where your weed seeds are. Did you want to add a couple of comments there just about this slide and any others in this module?
Well, I think this module is really about getting an understanding of what our target is. When we're talking about post-emergent herbicide control, we have a clear understanding what our target is. Our target's the leaves of the plants that we're trying to control, and we worry about whether they're broad and shiny and all those sort of things. When we're talking about pre-emergent herbicides, our target is the weed seed. So we really need to know where they are and what they're doing. And so that was the basis of this module. So it was understanding what's happening when we're cultivating the soil and how that might influence pre-emergent herbicides, but also understanding the differences between the various weed species we have and where they're germinating and how well pre-emergent herbicides may or may not be able to control those, so that you can make good choices about the products you need for particular weed species, depending upon your farming system and your soil type.
Chris, one of the things that we always talk about, and hopefully you can see the arrow there that I've just brought up, is these weeds that want to germinate just out of this furrow wall here. Very common with trifluralin. I think some of our more soluble herbicides, perhaps like Sakura, it's less of an issue, but still an issue. got any thoughts on what we can do to really manage those weeds that want to germinate out of this furrow wall?
Well, Pete, with pre-emergent herbicides, this is a real challenge. One way we can do it is to use the more soluble pre-emergent herbicides, and as you say, trifluralin has virtually no solubility, so it doesn't go anywhere very far. Pyzamide doesn't have a lot of solubility. We see some of the same issues. Sakura has a little bit more, but it's still not a lot. And so, you know, we actually have a real challenge around that space. So one thing is to use more soluble herbicides. Another tactic lots of people are looking at is thinking about, well, what happens if we go pre-emergent instead? However, that's got some real challenges where we have herbicides for which we don't have enough crop safety, because part of the value of that knife point system that we have is we actually move all of that soil out of that furrow, so that when the crop comes up, it's not actually going to get any of that herbicide. So putting more herbicide in the furrow can often be a bad thing. Really, probably our best tactic that we have to manage those is crop competition. If we can get the crop out of the ground, we can actually get it competing against those weeds.
I agree with that. I'll tell you one counter argument that we do get is some farmers say, well, if we have wider row spacing, we have less furrows and therefore less weeds because they've got less weeds coming out of the furrow wall. Have you got any thoughts on that? And which way would you argue? I'm all for narrow row spacing for crop competition, but these farmers do make a valid point as well.
Well, I think, you know, row space, unfortunately, you know, we have different ideal row spacings for the different crops we have in our system. So row spacing is a compromise. It's always a compromise. However, one of the things that we need to remember is that, yes, if we went for really wide row spacings, we would have fewer furrows and therefore less weeds coming out in the furrows. But what would happen is that any weed that germinated between the rows would have a lot less competition and would grow a lot larger and set a lot more seed. So in a way, the downside of going to very wide rows is probably more than the downside of having those weeds coming up in the furrow.
Yeah, I agree. I facetiously say, why don't we just sow one row of wheat across the middle of the paddock? But that is being a little bit of a smart aleck. Okay, so I need to get rid of my drawing mode there, and we'll move on to the next module. There's no questions coming in yet, so if you're out there listening in, make sure you put up a question. Now this is the next module where we're starting to talk a little bit about the solubility of the herbicides. And Chris, once again, this is you. This is something I've heard you speak a lot about over the years, and I guess we've got two big columns here, haven't we? We've got the solubility of the herbicide and its absorption to organic matter here, and it's a combination of those two numbers there that determines how far it moves. And I would tee off with a question: does one of these numbers matter more than the other, Chris, or is it really the combination of the two?
Well, one matters more than the other, but the combination is important. And in terms of, you know, how far your herbicide is going to move, you know, solubility in our soils in Australia is going to be the key component of this. It's where you've got molecules that have got similar types of solubility, where binding to organic matter in the soil really comes into play. But in terms of
atrazine here, for example, there's similar solubility but different KOC.
Yeah, so, you know, what that is telling you is that atrazine is going to go a lot further than diaryl. But it doesn't tell you it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the speed, and sometimes the speed's really important as well. But I think what this is really about is to try and get an understanding of the characteristics of the herbicides we're playing with, so that we can work out how to use them to get our weeds without damaging our crop. So it's about an understanding of where they're going to go. And, you know, so if we look right at the top there, flame, you know, highly soluble. We know that flame is going to go down through the profile with every rainfall event. It's not going to interact a whole lot with organic matter. and you know, it's got no problem getting to the weeds. So, you know, flame's going to be really easy. When we start getting down the bottom of the table, things get really interesting, and I think Sakura is probably the best example of how we need to think about these things. So, not a lot of solubility, but it doesn't really bind very much to organic matter. And what that means is Sakura doesn't move all that far, but on light soils with low organic matter, every time it rains, it's going to keep on moving. And so we sometimes, in some of those soil types, we do get some issues with Sakura controlling the weeds simply because it gets too deep. So, you know, we just need to understand that, you know, this means that on some soil types, we probably should be choosing a different pre-emergent herbicide. The other side of this is that if you've got, and one we don't have on here, and it's probably a good example of where we can run into trouble, is metazoclor. It's not on this table, but I'll tell you about it. Its solubility is the same as S-metolachlor, so it's right up near the top there, but it has even less binding to organic matter than anything on this table. And so in high rainfall situations, metazoclor turns out to be quite a dangerous product for crop safety because there's nothing holding it up and it's soluble. So it's that combination that really tells us where it's going to end up. Is it going to be safe? Will we get the weeds? Do we have to have something different because we've got a different soil type?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Chris. I mean, this is a really important table, isn't it? And I think part of what we're dealing with now as well is with this number here, with trifluralin, for example. Western Australia, we've got big crop residues. We had a good season last year, so a lot of people are probably steering a bit away from trifluralin this year because the chances of getting that through the stubble is difficult because it is tightly bound. Also, we just had a question come in, strip and disc systems, how will we make them work? I mean, that's a topic I really love, and just in answer to that, I mean, if you look at that, their trifluralin's out, isn't it, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's going to bind to all of that strip of stubble you've left there, and secondly, you're seeding with a disc seeder, so getting soil throw to incorporate trifluralin means that you can't use it, but it's really steering towards other herbicides. I know that Sakura gets probably a bit of a hammering really in the strip and disc system early on, but the bigger answer to the question is the growers that have been doing strip and disc have really used rigorous weed control for a few years, double breaks and then Sakura and stopping seed set and harvest weed seed control and all those things, and have found themselves not using any pre-em herbicides at all. So I know that this same person asking the question has said they've seen farmers in Vic go away from discs for these sorts of reasons, but yeah, so disc machines are a challenge, but yeah, I think it really comes down to the whole system, and I think if people adopt a strip and disc or just a disc seeder and don't really adopt the whole system, that's where they sometimes come unstuck.
Yeah, so I might just add to that, Pete, that one of the ways some of the strip and disc guys are managing this is, in fact, as you say, not to use the herbicides pre-emergent, but to be putting them in an early post-emergent situation. Of course, that has its own challenges because you see that, you know, some of the products that are not very soluble, you need quite a lot of rainfall to get them down through that residue that you've now laid flat on the ground. And down into the soil to be picked up and control these weeds. But in some areas, they've been really quite successful at that. So one of the advantages of those systems, of course, is that you can get your row spacings quite narrow in those systems, and that gives you extra competition and takes some of the pressure off the herbicides working. So it's a combination of, you know, mulch, competition, and then some activity out of your herbicides used in a different way.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I know Greg Condon, who's got a lot to do with strip and disc farmers, says that the 6 or 7 inch row spacing is an absolutely integral part of the system. All right, we need to keep moving, because otherwise we'll get a bit bogged down here, and we'll move on to the next module, talking about, and we probably need to be a little bit faster through these modules now, or we'll go all day, but in terms of degradation of herbicides and carryover. Chris, you spoke a bit about microbial degradation and also a little bit about soil moisture and soil temperature. And once again, I'd ask anyone to ask a question of anything to do with this, but any thoughts on either of these topics, Chris, just for a minute or so?
Look, I think that the importance of this is to understand that for the majority of the herbicides we're playing with, it's microbes that are breaking them down in the soil. So in terms of, particularly in terms of the issues of getting too much persistence and plant backs, we really need to focus on things that are going to affect the breakdown by microbes. So that is essentially soil moisture and temperature. They're the two biggies. If your soil is dry, you're not going to get any breakdown. If your soil is cold, you're not going to get a lot of breakdown. So we need to have warm, moist soils to get that breakdown. And so then we've got to be thinking about when does that happen in our system, and what does that actually mean for, you know, are we going to have the residues broken down enough that we can actually plant a crop?
Yep. Good one. All right, we've got no more questions there, but it is interesting that it is just about always microbes, and whatever drives microbes drives degradation. I think that's a really key point you brought up there, Chris.
I think, Pete, can I just add something there as well? It's come out a lot in a lot of the workshops, and it was one of the questions that came in as well. It's particularly interesting when we're starting to apply our pre-emergent herbicides at this early sowing window that we're in now, where in some paddocks across the country, we've still got quite a bit of temperature and we've potentially got moisture, or we might be dry. There's all sorts of paddock, situations out there. But if we're putting herbicides out now, while it's still relatively warm across the country in a lot of places, and if there's a bit of moisture, we'll be getting quite a bit of microbial degradation happening in the next week or two. And that will change very rapidly as we move into the more traditional planting window.
Yeah, okay. And so people could potentially have quite a bit of microbial degradation before they get their crop in. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and which is not necessarily going to affect your short-term weed control, but potentially if we're having some of the herbicides shoot up, it might affect your length of residual control coming out the other end of the, the program. Yeah.
Okay, and then on the flip side, with Western Australia, we've got bone dry soil. You could put herbicide out and seed into it now, and it'll probably sit there for weeks without any problems, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the real challenge is when you've got a bit of soil moisture and you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah. We've got another question came in about enhanced microbial degradation, and that is, if we use several seasons of a single residual herbicide such as atrazine, can that lead to build up of microbes which then break down atrazine quickly? I know, I think, Mark, you had a bit on that in one of the modules. I'll see if I can find that slide in a moment, but did you want to comment about enhanced microbial degradation?
Yeah, look, I think it's certainly a factor. It's probably, in my opinion, one of the things that we underestimate significantly. Where we're using the same herbicide frequently, I think we are building up populations of microbes in the soil that degrade that herbicide fast. In situations where we're using, say, 2 applications in the same crop, particularly if they're spaced, reasonable apart, maybe not necessarily on the same crop, but on the same paddock, in reasonably frequent. You put up one here, which is an old data set on propyzamide, and just to talk to that data, that was a split block. Propyzamide applied across the whole, half of the paddock, and then came back 77 days later and applied a second application to the whole paddock. So the black box only had the 1 second application. The white box had the 2 applications, and that's the weed control after the second application. So in that situation, 2 applications 77 days apart has substantially impacted the second application. What's going on? It's largely build-up of microbes waiting for that next hit of herbicide. So it is something that we're seeing, reasonably common in some of our programs.
Yeah, so the herbicides I can think of that are prone to this, propizamide have you got there, I think carbetamide is the other one, and atrazine. Dale Shanna in the US has done work on atrazine, hasn't he? Is there any other herbicides that either of you can think of which are prone to enhanced microbial degradation?
I think, Pete, that they all are to some extent or other. It's a case of whether it actually turns into a problem for us. But one that I think that, and Mark and I have had a conversation about this, but one that I think we have underestimated this is trifluralin, because, you know, back in the late 80s, we were worried about trifluralin carryover between crops, and of course nobody worries about that anymore.
Right, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are papers around the world, Pete, of it being reported with pendimethalin in a number of situations. I've never read a paper on trifluralin, but if it's happening with pendimethalin, pretty fair chance it's happening with trifluralin as well. And anecdotally, everything points to that effect from what we're seeing in the field.
Yep, okay. Paul McIntosh has just commented that chlorsulfuron as well in his experience. But like you say, Chris, they could all be affected.
Yeah, and you know, it's pretty well published on most modes of action because they're nearly all broken down by microbial degradation.
All right, heading back to module 5 now. Chris, this was you again and talking about what affects volatilisation. And we've got the vapor pressure of a few herbicides here. Did you want to comment a little bit about how much we lose these guys through, volatilisation into the air?
Look, you know, these are probably the only herbicides we really have to worry about that we're using as pre-emergent herbicides in terms of any volatilisation. So anything that's not on this table that we're using a pre-emergent herbicide, the volatilisation we're getting is inconsequential. But really, it's the ones at the top end of the table that are the ones where we're going to have most of the issue with. And so vapor pressure is only one part of the equation, I should point out. But if they don't, you know, if they can't form enough vapor pressure, they can't volatilise. So it is an important part of it, but it's not the only thing that drives it, because of course, one of the things that we know from all the work we've done, that we actually tend to lose more trifluralin if we don't incorporate it than we do trilate if we don't incorporate it. We of course know that clomazone is, you know, anybody who's ever applied clomazone knows that you get volatility out of clomazone. That needs to be incorporated really quickly. So this is a bit of, you know, a sense about how soon do we have to get things incorporated. So these are the ones we worry about getting incorporated. You don't have to be urgent unless you've got conditions where that volatility is going to occur. And that is essentially around moisture and temperature and wind. So if you have warm, wet, windy conditions, you're going to lose a lot of herbicide. If you've got cold conditions, you'll lose a lot less. If it's dry, you will lose very little at all. So it has to be moist, then you'll lose more if it's windy, and you'll lose more again if you have warmer temperatures. So our biggest issue is really guys who decide to put products out well in advance of sowing, decide that they won't bother incorporating until they get to the sowing operation. They get held up by rainfall. You know, they can get into trouble and lose their herbicide. And
just a bit further to that, we had these questions come in beforehand. If we start with the bottom question on the screen there, given, you know, you've just mentioned trifluralin volatilising, I know this will probably be how long is a piece of string, but have you got any rules of thumb, Chris or Mark, about how fast we lose trifluralin, how much we lose each day? And I guess we could make that comment based on conditions that are either perfect for volatilisation or conditions like dry soil where we get very little. So did you have any comments about rule of thumb?
Oh, I don't have an actual rule of thumb of an amount, but there is a data set in the presentation that looks at how much activity we lost over days comparing different seeding systems, and where we used the single low disturbance disc. That was the one where we lost it a lot faster than any other system. So basically we're saying that you don't need to cover it very much, but you need to cover trifluralin with a little bit of soil. So I'm not sure you'll find that too quickly, but there is.
I'm just trying to find it.
No, I don't think it's in that one.
Not in that
but
one.
I think people can go back and look for that, and they'll see that there actually is. So that's the one there. So if you're looking there, we're losing 40% over what's that, over 14 days. So you can calculate that back, and so that would have been done in May, that trial. So that would give you May. You're going to lose more in the daytime than you will at night. What we didn't have in here is I don't have actually a calculation of what all the rainfall events were. But if it's dry, it doesn't matter. You're not going to lose anything. It's only if it gets wet.
Right.
The other point I'd probably add there as well, Pete, was a few years ago we made a video up in the Liverpool Plains, up on the northern country, looking at different incorporation in, it was admittedly heavy vertisols, where we were throwing urea onto the ground and then looking at how the different seeders moved soil around and using the urea as a visual marker. What was really interesting out of that work was the very big differences in the level of incorporation that you got between different machines. So not just talking discs versus tines, but even within tines. And some setups giving you very good coverage, some giving you mixing through the soil, some giving you not so good coverage. So that's going to have it's probably going to have a bigger impact in my mind on rate of loss of herbicides probably than a lot of the other factors that we're thinking about.
So how do you get a higher loss of herbicide with that incorporation?
Well, not getting incorporation. So, if your system hasn't given you good soil cover, then you're going to lose more herbicide should you have conditions appropriate for volatilisation loss. And just I guess the point I'm trying to make was, we don't tend to even, we basically say, knife points and knife points, and they all give reasonably good incorporation. Well, they gave very different levels of incorporation. I wouldn't necessarily say they were all bad or good. It was just very different. So really understanding what your planter does is quite useful to understand what it's going to do with incorporating some of these more volatile herbicides.
Okay. Thank you for those answers. And the other question that came through, that I won't go back to it, but the question was around, if you have, say, a high trash load, you spray trifluralin onto that trash, we know it's tightly bound to it, but then you incorporate that trash with trifluralin on it, is the trifluralin then active?
Well, I think the short answer to that is not really. That's not really going to get you the activity you want, because it's still going to be stuck on the organic matter even though it's in the soil. So you actually have to wait for that organic matter to start breaking down before it's going to be available to be taken up.
And at the same time, the microbes are having a change. As soon as it's coming off the organic matter, the microbes are there to do their thing as well.
Yeah, okay.
So I think the strategy around it, the situation you're talking about in WA this year, where guys have got high residue loads and they're going to go, well, trifluralin's not going to work. Strategies are, as you say, to use something else or to get rid of that residue in some way, either baling it and taking it off or, burning it. But, back a couple of years ago when we had all that residue in the east after the 2016 season, I had lots of growers and consultants talk to me after seeding where they thought they could get through, but then they couldn't with their seeder and had to burn the stubble and wanted to know whether they still had their herbicide. The answer is no. If you burn the stubble, you're going to lose the herbicide if you put the herbicide out on the stubble. So make the decision before you go and spray.
Yeah, and I know that some WA farmers have been out with their seeders doing tests to see if they can get through the stubble, because they don't want to find themselves in that situation. If they can't get through it, like you say, they're better off burning it now and preferably getting some rain on it, which brings another question up. Chris or Mark, if you do burn stubble, you get all that carbon on the surface, does that bind herbicide or not? I've heard different stories over the years there.
Yeah, well, most of that stuff on the surface is ash, and ash doesn't bind herbicide. So you need, you know, charcoal, but burning stubble doesn't produce charcoal really. You need to burn trees to get charcoal. So no, the general answer is no, it doesn't. The problem we arise where we actually don't burn to the ground and you get all that chaff sitting on the surface, and that's a problem, because that means the herbicide can't then get down onto the soil as quickly as it needs to. So if you do burn the stubble, you do need to go and check and make sure that you actually have got it burnt to the ground and you don't have a layer of chaff sitting there. It's just easy. You kick some of the ash away and see if you've got chaff. If you've got chaff, you've got to do something about that, which might be just run over it with really lightly with some harrows just to break it up a bit.
Righto. Rightio. Now moving on to the next module, module 7. We've covered those couple of questions that came in. Make sure you keep questions coming in, everyone, if you have them. Another one of yours, Chris. He did a lot of these modules, but talking, I think, a little bit here about getting the most out of the pre-ems by combining them with post-em herbicides and with things like crop competition as well.
Yeah, look, I think that, you know, the thing that I think we've really learned about pre-emergent herbicides over the years of working with them is that they're great for early control, but they're not going to get you to the end of the season unless you have a range of other practices in place. And one of those practices is pre-emergent herbicides. So this was just an example where we used pre-emergent herbicides that actually had different levels of activity and persistence against ryegrass. So profisamide, a lot more persistent than atrazine for ryegrass control. And, you know, early in the season, we, you know, weren't seeing a massive amount there was some difference in the amount of ryegrass. Beg pardon, I'll take that back. Early in the season, 4 weeks after, we're seeing quite a big difference in the amount of ryegrass we had. Atrazine had worked. By the time we put the 2 post-emergent herbicides out there, we'd managed to get the number of spikes down to really low levels, but we'd already had our impact on yield at that stage. So that early competition with the atrazine not doing the work early meant that we ended up with lower yield. So even by getting the weed numbers down, we don't always get the best result. So it's this combination. We want to have a good pre-emergent herbicide up front, get us through that first phase while the crop's not competitive, and then bring the crop competition into play. And then we're going to look at, you know, stopping seed set at the back end of the season. And that way we'll protect all our yield and get our numbers down. So we're trying to do with pre-emergent herbicides, do the double job of maximising yield, minimising weeds.
Yeah, there's a pretty big difference in yield between Propis pre and atrazine pre there, isn't there? That's it's about half a tonne of canola. So that's extremely valuable.
Yeah, it was a fairly expensive choice to go with atrazine in that trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question just came in, Chris. How far can we push trifluralin incorporation if the soil is dry and conditions are relatively cool? How, can you give yourself a few days to incorporate the trifluralin under those conditions?
Oh, look, if it stays dry, you're good for a few days. That's not really the issue. The issue is that if you get some rainfall on it, and you don't need to get very much rainfall to start losing trifluralin. So you really got to watch. If you're going to play those games, you've really got to watch the weather and make sure that it is going to be dry. You're not going to get heavy dews and all those sort of things. But we've done this really quite successfully on dry soil. Left it a few days, been able to go back, and it's worked perfectly well. But it is all about the rainfall, so just watch out for the rainfall if you're going to do that. But what it means is that, yeah, look, you can leave it 24 hours, even 48 hours. That's not necessarily a problem. The problem is when the soil's wet or moist, and the surface is moist, and you've got warm conditions, then you probably need to come back more quickly. So it's a case of, how you spread your workload around and making sure that you don't get it wrong.
And Chris, I know something else that you've spoken a lot about at the updates is this idea of the early sowing, getting the crop away, getting that vigorous crop competition, whereas back in the day we used to say delay seeding, get a knockdown in your weedy paddocks. But you sort of say that you've changed your opinion there, and that you're more about that early sowing, early crop competition, get the crop getting away while it's warm.
Oh yeah, look, what we used to talk about is now all wrong because we have a completely different farming system. You know, now in these continuously cropped paddocks that have been continuously cropped for 10, 20 years, we're actually selecting for more dormant ryegrass that won't come up until you're sown. So it doesn't matter how long you wait, you're not going to get any more ryegrass to come up to kill with that knockdown. So why are we waiting? Particularly if we can go early and use that warmth that we have in the soil to get our crop out of the ground and provide competition, because particularly in cereals, there's not much we can do between the time that we put our pre-emergent herbicide out and when we come back at the back end of the season to do some harvest weed seed control. We actually don't have anything we can do with ryegrass in the middle. So competition's got to be it.
Absolutely. We won't let me get on my high horse about crop competition now. Mark, you got some comments?
I've actually got a question for Chris. Chris, when you move to those earlier timings, for those herbicides that can be a bit damaging to cereals, are you seeing a safety benefit by applying early, getting the crop out of the ground and getting it metabolized faster? You might not have any data, but you've got any gut feel that I would assume that that would be something I would expect that you would see.
Yeah, look, Mark, certainly in wheat we do see that. So where we've got some of those herbicides that can be a bit more damaging. And I think that it's probably, I don't know that how much of this is actually the wheat being able to metabolise it faster, though that's probably playing a role. I think it's more a case that the wheat recovers a lot more quickly because the conditions are warm and conducive to growth. And when we get into the depths of winter and wheat doesn't really like growing and you damage it with your pre-emergent herbicide, it can look pretty ugly for a pretty long time. And we see the same thing with canola. You know, if we hit canola with something that's damaging in that winter period, it just hates it. So I think it's a lot of it's really about that extra vigor we're getting from being in that warm ground, more perhaps so than it's degrading it, though that's just gut feel. Yeah. But we're certainly seeing a difference.
Righto, well that sort of keeps us moving along up to module 8 now, and talking about resistance to pre-ems. I mean, this is probably a bigger problem in the southern farming system than it is in the north, I think, at the moment. You can both comment on that. But Chris, we've had some pretty alarming data, and particularly out of the southeast of South Australia. We've got a lot of resistance to and cross resistance to our new pre-ems.
Yeah, look, Pete, this is a real concern because we were counting on these pre-emergent herbicides getting us out of trouble for a while, but what's happened, of course, is in these areas where trifluoride doesn't work, guys move to them pretty quickly and use them extensively, and so I think that it's just a lesson that herbicides aren't going to save us. They're part of the answer of where we're going, but they're not going to be the whole answer. And what we need to be thinking about with our pre-emergent herbicides is how do we really work them well so that we help protect ourselves a bit from resistance. And I think this is where making sure we're rotating modes of action, making sure that when we have to, we're mixing to make sure we get as good as an activity as we can. And we just have to have some of these non-chemical tactics as part of our setup. So, hay, crop topping, I know it's chemical, but it counts as non-chemical in this circumstance. Competition, harvest weed seed management, they've all got to be part of the deal. Otherwise, we'll just lose these pre-emergent herbicides as well.
The other big story here, of course, is testing, isn't it? There's just no pattern, so it's so hard going into a crop and knowing whether your herbicide is going to work or not. We don't know if there'll be cross resistance because that cross resistance pattern is unpredictable.
Absolutely.
Mark, any thoughts about your resistance to pre-ems in the north? You've probably been more reliant on post-ems in the recent decades.
Yeah, I guess no major changes in pre-emergent resistance that are obvious at widespread basis. Like everywhere, the Group B herbicides are selected over the years for a lot of the broadleaf weeds, sow thistle in particular, and still seeing that popping up everywhere. And then adding glyphosate on top of that is causing sow thistle problems are pretty widespread. But yeah, most of our pre-ems are sort of still holding in relatively well. Not to say we should get complacent, but yeah, we're not having too many issues that I'm aware of.
No, we're not into complacency in the resistance game, are we? Rightio. So, Mark, it is over to you now. I think we're into your module here, aren't we? Where we are talking a little bit about the pre-ems in the north. It's a little different to the south. You've got summer and winter crops, and you've got pre-ems being used or residuals being used in summer fallow as well. And so with that summer fallow in mind, some of the residuals that people are applying, some will last and some will not. And I think this slide on the screen shows a little bit of that. And also you've got photo degradation and volatilization. I was just wondering if you could unpick a little bit which ones are which in this
Sure.
slide.
I guess, if you're sort of looking at, where things differ when you're moving into a summer program, this is probably one area which can be quite different in that, we're typically getting multiple weed germinations over summer. So there's a cost-effective advantage there to, want to put down a residual herbicide at the start of summer and control multiple flushes. So there's certainly, a lot of fallow paddocks getting treated. So what does that mean when you come to using our residual herbicides? We don't have the incorporation by sowing because they're literally going out on the bare ground after harvest of the crop. So anything that's going to volatilize, so Chris talked about those more volatile herbicides, that sort of takes out particularly the high volatile herbicides. We really can't use those. The other issue is, before I get to that, what it means from an incorporation point of view is we're wholly reliant on rainfall in a zero-till farming system. So most growers will look to put the herbicides out prior to a rainfall event. And of course, with our summer rainfall events, just because it's forecast to rain on Friday doesn't mean it's going to happen. And it might happen on your next door neighbour's place, but maybe not on your place. So frequently we get situations where all best intentions, we thought we're going to have a rainfall event, the herbicide's gone out and it hasn't rained. And you may sit there for some weeks till the next rainfall event. So really interesting whether the herbicide's being broken down by UV light as well as being lost to volatilization. So if you look at the herbicides I've put on the table there to give some sort of relativity between the two, well, it almost takes trifluralin out of the program because it's broken down by UV degradation and also by volatilization loss. So really difficult to make that work. Metallochlor, pendimethalin, those next two, they are both impacted by volatility, but not to the same degree as trifluralin. And they're both also broken down by UV light. So if you get rainfall within, a few days after application, losses aren't significant. But, those labels talk about if you haven't had a rainfall event within 7 to 10 days, that you might want to think about mechanically incorporating. Now, usually, we don't want to mechanically incorporate a zero-till fallow, but the trade-off is if we haven't had that rainfall event, we're going to lose a fair bit of herbicide after a couple of weeks if they haven't been washed into the soil. So that can be a downside of those herbicides. Your Group C herbicides aren't really volatile to any significant impact, but they are broken. Most of them have slow UV degradation. So my rule of thumb is you're talking, sort of multiple weeks of the herbicide sitting out there baking in a summer. Again, this is summer, so it's high UV intensity. And if you're getting multiple weeks that they haven't been washed into the soil, then we should be expecting we're starting to lose significant quantities of your Group C herbicides. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum. I've put a couple of examples there, Balance and Flame. those herbicides aren't volatile and they're not broken down by UV light. So they're happy to sit out there and wait for the next rainfall event. So it's really understanding, which breakdown pathway is significant and how that's going to impact the choice of herbicide you're going to use and how that's going to align with rainfall events, really.
Yeah, righto. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, so any, just I guess the question, and I don't know a great deal about your farming system, but what are the most common residuals used in summer fallow?
All of those apart from trifluralin.
Right, okay.
So, it depends a little bit on the spectrum that we're chasing, but, those herbicides and combinations of those herbicides, your dual stomps have more grass activity, balance has got both, flames probably more in the grasses, but then your group C's come in and balance comes in for your broadleafs. So yeah, it really depends on the spectrum you're trying to chase. And just as important to that is what your plan is for your following crop, because that's going to dictate which choice of herbicide you're going to go to as well.
Righto. Okay, well, if there's any questions about that, keep them coming in. We'll keep moving. I'll move on to the next module, Mark. We've got just 5 or so minutes left. And irrigation, not something that those of us in the southern farming system know a great deal about, but I guess the upside is you've got control over how much water you put on. So Mark, is it really just understanding your herbicide and knowing how much to irrigate after applying that herbicide? Is that a fair part of the game here?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is understanding the mobility of your herbicide, which comes back to that combination of solubility and the binding to organic matter and soil colloids. A more mobile herbicide is potentially going to get into the profile easier, quicker, with less volume of irrigation, and potentially can move a long way down the profile. So, in the worst case situation, if you've got, say, a pivot overhead irrigation, and you've got really dry soil, you just planted your crop, you put your herbicide in at that planting operation, and then you go and apply inches of overhead irrigation, you're going to move that herbicide a long way down, and you can get into potential issues with crop injury. So if you've got a more mobile herbicide, you might want to really consider putting a light pass on to get that herbicide stabilised in the soil as much as you can. Other herbicides require more rain to actually get them in and get them incorporated. So some of the labels actually talk about some of those rainfall amounts that you're looking for to get the herbicide into the soil and actively working. So it was sort of the point of some of those rainfall events are put in there. The other point I'd also add as well is consideration of the type of irrigation. So if it's coming from overhead irrigation, such as a pivot, you've got some ability to control how much you put out, and it's coming from above, so it's going to move the herbicide vertically down the profile. If you're in a furrow situation, you really can't control how much water you're applying, because you're saturating the paddock to your full water holding capacity, and you've got horizontal movement across the paddock as well. So again, if your herbicide is going to be mobile, it's going to have a different wetting profile. So those things sort of need to be considered when you're using residual herbicides in irrigation systems.
And so, Mark, with that, say you're using a herbicide like metolachlor and you've got dry soil, do people sometimes, do a wetting up pre and then apply the herbicide and then just that little bit of moisture to incorporate it, rather than putting all the moisture on in one whack?
Yeah, if you're using metolachlor in irrigation systems, and cotton's probably the classic, you can get a reasonable amount of damage if you're going into a dry profile. Put your herbicide out, apply a large amount of moisture, or you get a big storm, one of the two. That can be quite damaging. So one strategy with those mobile herbicides can be that you water up first and then apply your herbicide, and you may, if your soil's still moist, you may have enough moisture without needing any further moisture to get incorporation. Or alternatively, and what's becoming much more common, particularly with metallochlor, is we're moving the application to an early post-emergent window. And so, particularly in the case of cotton, as a classic example, where you've got Roundup Ready cotton out there, and we can use the first Roundup application to clean up any emerged weeds and apply metallochlor very early in the crop post-emergent, which is now registered on some of the labels, and get the herbicide on in that situation. Once the crop's out of the ground, you've got much higher level of safety. So yeah, sort of looking at some of the properties and aligning them with how we're best utilising them, both for weed control and for crop safety, is a really important way to understand how to get the best out of them.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Mark. And I think we're down to our last module now. I think this one is more a bit about the residuals post-emergent in summer crops. Got some of the over-the-top applications here, but also you talk a little bit about the lay-by application, like this here, where it's either lay-by or directed in between the rows. Mark, I'll just leave it to you to add any comments to this. I guess from my perspective, I'm just interested to find out how much shield spraying or lay-by spraying is done, or is it more with just the over-the-top herbicides?
I guess, Pete, to answer that sort of question first, lay-by applications were very common in, well, still are relatively common in sorghum, but were very common in cotton prior to the advent of Roundup Ready cotton, when we had to rely heavily on residuals for our weed control. So generally, go back prior to Roundup Ready cotton, there was in almost all situations a pre-emergent herbicide application, but then also a later application of some sort of directed offering, because usually those herbicides were too damaging to go straight over the top. So you're looking at putting the herbicide down in the interrow. And I guess the other point that also is really important to keep in mind here is we're talking crops like cotton and sorghum with at least 1 metre row spacings, if not wider. So plenty of opportunity for weeds to emerge, and pretty hard to make crop competition work, early crop competition work, when you've got those big wide rows. So you've really got to do something to manage that. So hence that's where we sort of we're looking to apply those herbicides. Now, more recently, as I sort of just alluded to, with the advent of Roundup Ready crops, we can go over the top with Roundup, and some herbicides can go over the top. And probably the classic one has been the metallochlor use patterns with Dual and Bouncer to register those over the top of cotton and still get enough crop safety. But a lot of the other herbicides which I had there, really can't go directly over the top, so they've got to be directed. Probably just jump back to that other slide that you had there in between those two slides there, Pete. Next one down. So yeah, those particular herbicides are too damaging to go over the top of the cotton, so they need to be directed and get them into the interrow, and then we're trying to manage with either interrow cultivation or irrigation to incorporate those herbicides, but does require the crop to be fairly well established in most situations. So yeah, so different ways to use pre-emergent herbicides, getting in a bit later, but again, thinking about using them in that context where they're big wide rows, multiple rainfall events or irrigations over summer, generating multiple weed flushes throughout the crop. So a need to hit those weeds at multiple times.
I guess the thing that springs to mind for me is that there being lay-by or shield spraying is just a whole lot harder than just a glyphosate over the top of a Roundup Ready crop, isn't it? So no surprises that Roundup Ready's been so popular in your part of the world, given that you've got limited over-the-top options.
Yeah, and we went, particularly in the cotton situation, we went through a 10 to 15 year period where there was very little pre-emergence or lay-by applications were applied, things are starting to change fairly fast as there's significant weed populations escaping through the Roundup only programs. So that means we've got to remember what we used to know.
Yeah, that's right. We do. And so sometimes there's benefits of being that little bit older, Mark.
You got it.
Okay, well, our hour is up and we've pretty much covered all the questions that came in. There was one there about broadleaf weed control in pulses. We might leave that question because I'm not sure we can answer it given we're talking about pre-ems and residuals. Unless, Chris, you've seen that question and you've got an answer to it, or Mark. Single disc seeders and... Oh, this question is any recommendations for broadleaf control in pulses with a single disc? I'm not sure that we have that covered in this program or not. But,
look, I think this is a space where we're moving to in terms of our farming systems, but it's going to be a few years before we've got products that'll be able to do that. So there's some new products in the wings that might be able to actually fit that bill.
Righto. Good to know. Yeah, we are seeing that bit of wave of new products coming through, aren't we, Chris? We've got they're almost like the 90s again, when we've got a host of new products that are either just hitting the market or coming out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so, but I mean, a lot of the products that we're getting, you know, the difficulty we're going to have is that they're still going to be in the south, mainly suited to knife points and press wheel type systems. So it's finding those ones that are safe to use in the disc setup that's the struggle.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Mark and Chris. We've gone for a full hour there. We had some questions come in and we've pretty much reviewed every module of the herbicide course, the herbicide pre-em herbicides 101 course through Diversity Era. This recording will go up on the website so people can listen to any bits of it later if they like. But yeah, thanks very much, Chris and Mark, for joining us, and thanks everyone else for dialing in and joining us today. And yeah, please, if you've done the Diversity Era courses and you've enjoyed them, make sure you tell other people about them as well. The Weed Smart funding made it all possible, and Mark and Chris were very generous to give up their time and to do that course and also be part of this today. So thanks, Chris, thanks, Mark, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.